Good afternoon and welcome back to this teleconferencing session. In this session, we shall talk about BNS 107, that is Pediatric Nursing. We shall be discussing on Block 2, that is Nursing Management of Children with Medical Surgical Problems. The topic for presentation is Nursing Care of Children with Central Nervous System Disorders. To discuss this topic, we have Dr. Mrs. Jyoti Serene, who is Principal and Professor, College of Nursing in Ambala. We have Ms. Surekha Sama, who is Registrar Delhi Nursing Council, and we welcome them both to this teleconferencing session. Before I ask them to start the session, I would request all the regional directors to send us the attendance and ask the students to send their queries and questions by phone or fax. Ms. Surekha, what are the different common congenital anomalies of central nervous system?
As nurses, what we commonly see in the ward, in the newborn units, is congenital malformations of the central nervous system, which commonly are seen as spina bifida, hydrocephalus. The swellings at cisterna magna may be at any level of the spinal cord, and as a result of congenital malformations, the other medical conditions which may result with are like infections which result into meningitis and other sequelae effect which may result into long-term conditions like spasticity, muscle tone defects. The child may be stunted in growth. They are the other sequelae of the defects which may occur. But commonly that we see in the ward are the defects within the union of the transverse or the central spinal processes of the spinal column, which may result into herniation of the contents of the brain or along with spinal meninges along the length of the central nervous canal.
We shall be focusing on one of the important congenital anomaly, that is hydrocephalus. Will you explain what exactly is hydrocephalus?
Right. We come to hydrocephaly, the commonest disorder. This is, as you might have seen, the child's look is with enlarged head, and that enlarged head may be because of the accumulation of the cerebrospinal fluid within the meninges, within the subarachnoid space, compressing upon the central nervous system. If we look into the appearance of the child looks exactly like this. He has enlarged head, and his forehead is usually bossing over, which is causing pressure on the eyes, and cornea are usually drooping down, and the white sclera is visible. Before we get into all these conditions, I think we need to go back to the previous one, and let's see how we define hydrocephalus. This is enlargement of the head with abnormal accumulation of the cerebrospinal fluid within the subarachnoid space.
Yes, please, Hyderabad, please speak up. Yes.
Good afternoon, I am calling from Hyderabad, madam.
Yes.
Is the class is taken for the first year or the second year, madam? First year students are gathered here.
No, this is for second year.
For second year, ma'am?
Yes.
The portion is being taken for second year, ma'am?
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, we may continue.
Yes.
Right. This accumulation in the subarachnoid space results because of two reasons. One reason is that there is accumulation because of obstruction to the normal flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. The other reason could be that there is incomplete or there is no absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid, and that's why it is getting accumulated within the internal structure where the flow has to be there, or it is flowing outside the spinal column from the from the central part to the peripheral area also, but yet there is obstruction to the flow. If we look into the etiology, then we find that there is increased production, it's mainly because of choroid plexus tumor. Choroid plexus, as you know, are the vesicular structures which are in the floor of the ventricles, lateral ventricles, third and fourth ventricles. The process of secretion of CSF is within these structures. In a day, about 750 ml of cerebrospinal fluid may get secreted within the CSF canal. The other reason that we found in the hydrocephalus is obstruction to the flow, which may be because of the inflammatory conditions, where maybe adhesions and the swelling has compressed onto the flow, and the flow is obstructed and is resulting into the swelling. There may be congenital stenosis of the aqueduct between the third and the fourth ventricle. There could be atresia of the foramen, which may result into obstruction to the flow. There could be tumor or hematoma within the structures, which may result into obstruction. The other reasons could be that there is interference with the absorption of the cerebrospinal fluid, and that's how it is getting accumulated and causing pressure onto the structures. In the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid, we find that just like that we have seen in the earlier slide. If you look into this slide, you find that in the subarachnoid space, the arrows are showing that from choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles, how the cerebrospinal fluid is getting into the subarachnoid space. It is getting circulated within that space and then through cisterna magna, and it goes into the spinal canal. If there is been a tumor of the choroid plexus, that can result. If there is stenosis of the aqueduct of Sylvius, then also there can be obstruction resulting into excessive accumulation, or any atresia into the foramina can also result. So that tells us about the etiology of the hydrocephalus.
What are the different types of hydrocephalus?
When we look into the types, there are mainly two types. One is congenital and one is acquired. The congenital are but obvious that they are present at the time of birth because of any of the conditions which are mentioned in the previous slide. In the acquired one, it could be due to the infections or the acquired tumor, hematoma, injury, which could result into this.
What is the medical management of hydrocephalus?
The cephalus is mainly managed with the drugs medically, but it is also managed surgically. If we look into the medical management, it's symptomatic. The drugs are given to reduce the intracranial pressure, like diuretics. Mannitol, not the diuretic, but it is one of the miscellaneous drugs which by way of osmotic pressure releases the reduces the intracranial pressure and results into decreasing the other symptoms. If the child is having acquired hydrocephalus, where the child had primary infection, the infection may be treated with antibiotics. If the child has other symptoms because of that, there may be fever, there may be respiratory problems, and there will be convulsions. The child will be given anticonvulsant drugs, the child will be given antipyretic drugs, the child may be given drugs to ease out his breathing pattern. And if we go into the details of the medicines, then I'm sure the nurses working in the units are familiar with the drugs.
I think we should go directly to the surgical management of the hydrocephalus.
Okay. If we go into the surgical treatment, the most common approaches which are being used are ventriculostomy. This ventriculostomy is actually done by way of burr hole, directly making an opening into the lateral ventricles and making a passage for the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. This procedure is also called as Torkidson's procedure, and the child is usually given temporary to permanent relief with ventriculostomy. Depending upon the reason, if the child has had choroid plexus tumor, then of course choroid plexectomy may be done for the child. The most common surgical interventions which are used are the shunting procedures, by which the bypass is made for the excessive CSF from the ventricles or their normal path to the extraventricular space. The two surgical interventions are ventriculoperitoneal shunt and ventriculoatrial shunt. The ventriculoperitoneal shunt is, as the name itself suggests, that a bypass by way of a elastic catheter is made from the ventricles into the peritoneal cavity. A subcutaneous, between the layers of the skin, the catheter is passing from the lateral ventricle to the peritoneum. The ventriculoatrial shunt is again the same procedure, but it is from the ventricles of the brain to the right atrium. Then it goes into the normal circulation and then into the systemic circulation, and that's how the excretion of it takes place. The basic objective or the target of the operation is to have a passage for the excessive fluid so that it gets drained from within the cavities of the brain to the extracranial cavity and then gets excreted from the body and giving relief to the child. The ventriculoperitoneal or the ventriculoatrial shunt, they both are very similar, but most common is ventriculoperitoneal, because atrial shunting again gives rise to infection within the heart, on giving more chances of post-operative complications like endocarditis. To prevent that, it is preferred is ventriculoperitoneal shunt. So these are some of the surgical interventions which are commonly practiced.
What nursing care is being given to these patients?
Yes, here is a visual I would like the viewers to, the students to have a look, which is showing that the catheter which is placed into the lateral ventricle at the floor of the ventricles, and then it is having a one-way valve towards the ventricle which does not allow the backflow of it and provides a passage for the continuous flow from the high area of pressure to the lower area, and the other end of the catheter is in the peritoneal cavity. Now, answering to the question that how do we take care of these children, obviously it is understood that these children have to have surgical interventions done. Medically, if the child is managed, we do look after the child, where the most important thing is to assess the child's vital signs, get into to see the occipitofrontal diameter and record these observations and nursing assessments, and give comfort to the child, look into the feeding pattern of the child. The child is already losing weight and is uncomfortable because of enlarged head and decreased weight of the body. So handling of the child is a problem. So the mother has to be really educated and supported how to handle the child, how to put the child to the bed, how to hold the child when the child has to be fed, how the child has to be protected from infection in the pre-op period. But ultimately we will see that how pre-operatively the child needs to be assessed. If we get into the each area of assessment, basically the assessment will be based on the history of the child and the physical assessment. The history of the child would say that either this was present at the time of birth, or the child has got some infection which has resulted into the slow onset with enlargement of the head. If we look into the physical assessment of the head appears enlarged. It has, the fontanelles are bulging, the sutures are wide, the skin, because of the underneath fluid collection, appears very shiny and thin. The scalp veins are very visible and dilated. Because of the increased pressure, as we had seen in the earlier visual, that the child's forehead is appearing bossing like, and it has lot of pressure onto the orbital cavity, by which the child is most of the time, it appears that the child is looking down, because that is because of the increased pressure in the ocular cavity, and the cornea, the sclera is visible above the cornea. This is called as setting sun sign, because the child's eyes are all the time rolling down. The child's eyelids are drooping because of the increased pressure. The child appears very irritable. He has high-pitched, very shrill cry, which is very typical, doesn't sound good and disturbs the mother as well as the caretaker. The child is anorexic. He has vomiting. His body weight is less than the head. The sucking difficulty is seen in the child. The child also appears ataxic and spastic because of the decreased muscle tone. When we get into the diagnosis, because assessment will not only be based on to the physical signs but the history of the child, as I said earlier. The other investigations which may give us the clue for the complete diagnosis is CAT scan, pneumoencephalography, ventriculography, CSF findings. So as a nurse, we may have to look into the reporting of each of the investigations. CAT scan actually is very non-invasive and comfortable procedure which tells us exactly the location of the obstruction or of the tumor or of the foramina stenosis, or if there has been any atresia, the level of it can be exactly seen. Pneumoencephalography is not a very comfortable procedure for the child, even otherwise it is an invasive procedure where the child has to be really prepared, and it takes time also. So if facility for CAT scan is available, pneumoencephalography may or may not be done. Similarly, ventriculography also may or may not be done. Both the procedures are done in the X-ray department, and the subarachnoid space is filled with air, either oxygen or helium, but at the same time the cerebrospinal fluid is also withdrawn. So the amount withdrawn is replaced with the air, and that helps in the finding the location of the obstruction. The cerebrospinal fluid findings tell us about what is the character, color and biochemical constituents of the CSF, which would be more helpful if the child has had history of infection, especially injury or meningitis or encephalitis, or it has been because of drug, or it has been because of other disease condition. If we have to plan based on our assessment the nursing care of the child, it is best that the child is assisted for both the medical management, as the child would be prepared preoperatively and continued with the care in the postoperative period. In the medical management of such cases, the child would be helped in investigation procedures, like we have said, CAT scan, ventriculography, pneumoencephalography, lumbar puncture when it is done. So it is important that the child and the family and the mother especially is prepared for the procedure. The child is made comfortable, positioned well, and taking all the precautions to have protection of the child from infection. All aseptic precautions may be maintained in order to do the lumbar puncture, and CSF which is collected may be sent timely for investigations and reports recorded and reported. In the preoperative period, it is important that we continuously assess the child for his head circumference and make a note how much increase is taking place. So it is essential that once in 24 hours the head circumference is taken. The child is assessed for signs of raised intracranial pressure, which may be irritability, crying, shrill cry. The child may be having convulsions. He is refusing to feed. The child is uncomfortable, restless. The child is having changes in his vital signs. It may show that the child is having marked increase in temperature with the proportional increase of the pulse rate. It may be irregular rate rhythm if it is associated with other infections also. Invariably, the child would be coming with congenital anomalies and the infection. So obviously the child's pulse rate and temperature would be proportionately increased. Depending upon which area is getting compressed with the collection of the fluid, the child's medulla oblongata may be getting compressed, giving rise to respiratory problem. The child's breathing may be shallow and rapid and difficult, of course. The child's behavior would also be seen, that very irritable, restless child, not accepting feeds, crying all the time, inconsolable. And we carry on with all this assessment and record. The other important preoperative management of the child includes protecting the child from infection, which means any invasive procedure to be done in aseptic precautions. The child skin needs to be taken care of, because any break in the skin of the scalp or skin elsewhere in the body would give rise to, openness route to the infection, because the scalp over the skin is already the skin over the scalp is already thin and shiny. The child's head is having excessive weight, so putting the child on the head in the recumbent position can give rise to a little break in the skin in the occipital area. So that needs to be taken care of. Some sort of ring may be placed so that a direct pressure between the child and the bed is being lifted up, and there is no break in the skin. Whenever the child is handled, his head has to be supported well. The mother also needs to be taught about that, educated about how to handle the child. One hand should always be under the head of the child whenever the child is lifted either from the bed, or the child is being held for feeding, or the child is being taken for investigation procedure, or the child's head is being bent for lumbar puncture. So that's very important. The child, if the child is old enough, say 8 months, 12 months old or little older, the child would also be having headaches. So the child needs to be taken care of that also. Invasive, the lumbar puncture may be done at more than one occasion. So it is important that the child is protected from infection. His feeding, if it has artificial feeding, then care should be taken that clean procedure is maintained so that the child doesn't get into infection. The other important thing is that the child's hydration, because the child is anorexic, the child is having anorexia, vomiting, he may be losing lot of electrolytes and water from the body, and he does not take enough of fluids. In case the child is not able to take orally enough, he may be started on intravenously. Parenteral therapy may be given to the child. That's again protecting the child from infection would be important. The nutrition needs extra care also, because the child is already having less of weight and we need to prepare the child for surgery. Any inability of the child to withstand the surgical procedure and the intervention would not be appropriate if the child's nutritional status is poor. Ensuring comfort and alignment of the body, as I have already said, while handling, it's very important that the head is and the rest of the body posture is maintained. The parents and the mother especially needs to be emotionally supported, educated, and her help should be taken in care of the child. She may be allowed to handle the child, feed the child at any time, observe the child, tell her what are the abnormal findings or any variations she may observe in the respiration or in the behavior of the child. She may report it. While taking care of the skin, if there is any breakdown noticed by her, she may report it. So that type of education and support of the mother would emotionally prepare her, and she will feel satisfied in the care of the child. One point, care of skin has already been said earlier. So these are some of the very important areas and parameters which needs to be taken care of in the preoperative period. Carrying on with the postoperative care of the child, we need to continuously monitor the child for the same parameters which were carried out in the preoperative period. That is, measuring the head circumference of the child, seeing the fontanelles, looking into the sutures, looking into the cry of the child, the skin breakdown. But in the postoperative period, it is essential that we also look into the dressing at the head and as well as at the insertion point of the catheter, that's in the abdominal area. The child's changes in the vital signs in the post-operative period may also tell us if the child is having any deterioration because of the obstruction to the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. We may have to check the drainage site by just compressing the chamber of the catheter, which usually is at the site of the mastoid process, just behind the ear, above the neck. That area may be just compressed and released to make sure whether there is flow to the CSF or not. If there is any hardness being felt, that shows that there is obstruction to the flow, and that may be repeated. If the child's cry is shrill, his breathing is low, his pulse rate is very rapid, or it is irregular in its rhythm, and that has to be reported. In the initial 24 hours or even in the first 3 to 4 days, the child normally will have fever. So a slight fever in the postoperative period will not be so much of a concern as it is a variation from the normal range, but it's normal in the postoperative period. But if there is persistent increase in the head circumference, or it is remaining the same, or it is increasing, that has to be reported. Then the site of the shunt may be inspected for any oozing, for any drainage, for any soakage. Maintaining the position of the child is very important. We have to, in the first 24 hours, the child's position may be maintained in the supine position with the head straight. Thereafter, the child's position can be with the head turned towards a non-operated side, because that gives us chance to observe the area, as well as it helps to alleviate the pressure on the operated side. The child's, while lifting, the same precautions will have to be taken, that the operated side will have to be, the head will have to be supported. The child is without pillow, but again some sort of support would be needed. In the postoperative period, administration of medications would also continue, which will include antibiotics, anticonvulsant drugs, antipyretic drug, or precaution should be taken that the child is not given any narcotics or respiratory depressants, because that will mask the signs of respiratory distress if the child gets any, and it would further deteriorate the condition of the child. So whatever are the related precautions as a nurse which we have to follow in calculation of the dose, following the time and dilution of the medications, or the time duration in which they have to be administered, that has to be followed by the nursing person. Continuing with the postoperative care, we need to educate the parents and also support them, because they are very scary with lot of anxiety. Having their participation in the care of the child, to handle the child, feed the child, ask questions and ventilate themselves would make them more comfortable. And they need to be educated how to lift the child, how to support the child's head. They may be also shown any warning signs like soakage at the operated site, or if they find any bulging in the head, any pulsation in the head, that the mother can also report. Avoiding any type of strain to the child. If the child cries, that also obviously increases his pressure within the cranial cavity. If the child does not pass his stool in the postoperative period, then also it strains the child's intracranial cavity, so those needs to be taken care of. The child may be given some sort of soothing and comfort so that he does not cry. The child may be having pain, so analgesics may be administered as per the SOS orders. The child needs to be seen if the child is taking regular feed, and in the postoperative period, in the 1 or 2 days the child has not passed stool, then he needs to be administered laxative and reported. Then whatever gets ordered, that needs to be given. in the long-term care of the child, it is important that we start preparing the parents in the post-operative period. At the time of the discharge, the mother may be taught how to position the child, how she needs to take care of the skin of the child, how she has to monitor the child for any untoward symptoms, how she has to continuously monitor the functioning of the shunt. She may have to be shown actually and demonstrated, and a return demonstration may be taken from the mother to see how is she able to compress the bulb of the catheter, which is in the neck or at the mastoid process. The mother may be educated how she should compress it and how she should release it, and what observations she will have to make in order to see that the shunt is functioning normally. The revision of the shunt will be done as the child grows, so she will have to come for regular follow-up to the hospital, and whenever the child requires a revision, she will have to be prepared again for that. The weight of the child, the feeding pattern of the child, the vaccinations to the child, they need to be properly told to the mother, and in her regular follow-up, her weight record and feeding behavior should be recorded along with the head circumference and functioning of the shunt. The child needs to be prepared. As the child grows, he will not be able to participate in some of the games like football or the games which would require a lot of running and which are strenuous. So the mother and the child, they both need to be prepared that the child cannot indulge into these activities because they will be strenuous for the child. The child should be protected from the injury. The child needs to be protected from the infection. So this kind of education is important for the mother to be prepared for. I think that would answer many of the things, although I comprehensively have said that.
I think all the points have been said very well in elaborative manner, and I think once I take the next topic, I will skip off many of the pre-operative and post-operative care which has already been dealt.
Another most important and main congenital malformation of central nervous system is spina bifida. What is spina bifida and how it presents like?
Yes, Ms. Surekha has already dealt with you one of the common congenital anomaly of the central nervous system, that is the hydrocephalus, and the other most common congenital anomaly related to the cerebral dysfunction which is seen in the infants is spina bifida, and those of you who are working in pediatric surgical ward must have seen patients with spina bifida. And as Madam Pittikal also has said, that this is one of the common anomaly. Now what it is and what are various types of it and what are the common problems associated with these children. To define spina bifida, it is a congenital anomaly which results due to failure of fusion of vertebral arches. So once the vertebral arches fail to fuse, it means what will happen? Meninges will protrude out, CSF will protrude out. If it is extensive, then even the spinal column may be displaced. So from the definition itself we can make out that there are different types of spina bifida. Majorly we can classify it as spina bifida occulta and spina bifida cystica. Spina bifida occulta. Occulta means which is hidden. It means there is a defect, but it is hidden. It will not manifest unless and until the child grows up to the school age and the child presents with certain cutaneous manifestation or foot ulceration may be there, or there may be alteration in gait. Otherwise, spina bifida cystica can be readily detected right at the time of birth. As you can see on this slide, that there are two diagrams shown. One is, it is of neural tube defect, and you can see the baby is placed either in the prone position or in the sideline position. Okay. So this is the spina bifida. It's a sac which you can see in the lumbosacral area. Okay, and God has been great that it is most commonly located in the lumbosacral area. It means the area below that, maybe the urinary part, maybe the bowel functions or the motor ability of the lower limb will be affected, whereas the upper part above the sac will be normal in function. Now, as I was telling you about the types of it, I told you about spina bifida occulta. Usually if you find a baby is born and there is a tuft of hair in the lumbosacral region, that baby should be further investigated, is there any spinal cord defect or not. Or if suppose at the school age children, if they present with foot ulceration or alteration in gait is there, or certain other cutaneous malformations appear, then this child should be further investigated. Whereas spina bifida cystica you will be able to detect right at the time of birth, and whether it is, again it can be classified as two types, meningocele and meningomyelocele. Now what is meningocele? As the name indicates, that the sac will contain meninges and CSF. Whereas meningomyelocele, it means there is meninges, there is CSF, along with it there is also spinal cord. Spinal column is also displaced. So it means if you judge yourself which will have the neurological problem, it is, of course the answer will be myelomeningocele. So meningocele is not associated with the neurological deficit, whereas myelomeningocele is associated with the neurological deficit. I hope the types spina bifida occulta and cystica further classified as meningocele and myelomeningocele. Now, if a child is born with spina bifida cystica or spina bifida cystica, whether it is meningocele or meningomyelocele, the first and foremost observation of the nursing personnel should be that what is the size of the sac, where the sac is located, and is the sac soft or is the sac hard. Okay, if the sac is soft, it means it is having only the meninges and the CSF. You can say it is meningocele. Whereas if it is hard, it means there is also some spinal column been displaced, and it can be myelomeningocele. Further, other investigations need to be done, like CT scan, like MRI may have to be done to detect what is the exact defect, whether it is myelomeningocele or meningocele. Now, this defect can be easily detected in the antenatal period also. How? Alpha-fetoprotein can be assessed, and if alpha-fetoprotein are elevated, it will give an indication that the fetus may be suffering with a neural tube defect. Or ultrasonography can be done at the gestational age of 8 to 10 weeks or any time before 12 weeks, and this neural tube defect can be detected. By the virtue of administration of folic acid in the women who belong to the childbearing age, this incidence has reduced to an extent. So folic acid administration before conception, if mother takes it for 3 months, then the incidence of spinal cord defect or the neural tube defect in the fetus are going to be comparatively less. These are the research findings which have shown us this. Now, as I told you that you saw in the diagram also, the baby was placed either in the prone position or in the side-lying position, because we don't want the sac to have the pressure and to rupture, because once it will rupture, it is a source of infection, it will become a portal entry for infection, and it can lead to meningitis. Sometimes spina bifida may also be associated with certain other congenital anomalies that we call as Vactral anomalies. So when you assess a child who is born with a congenital anomaly, try to also rule out associated anomalies. Once I say Vactral anomalies, it means one is vertebral, it is also already present. It can be anorectal anomalies, it can be cardiac anomalies, it can be tracheoesophageal anomalies, or it can be anomalies in the limbs. So once you are doing a nursing assessment of a newborn, please try to assess a newborn for any visible congenital anomalies, any associated congenital anomalies. Now, because a child is born with a congenital malformation, as per my experience and the clinical experience, it shows that mothers are too apprehensive to hold these babies because they fear that if they hold the baby, it may cause pressure and it may lead to rupture or there may be leakage of CSF. And at times I have seen cases, those babies who were born in the rural area and the cases were conducted by midwives, they try to reduce the size of sac by puncturing it, and finally when the baby reaches to the clinical area, to the hospital setting, maybe the infection as meningitis has already set in. Sometimes spina bifida children, babies may also have another congenital anomaly as hydrocephalus, what Madam Surekha has already discussed with you in detail. Now, in the pre-operative period, mainly what we have to concern is about the position. We have to do the complete assessment, see whether what is the motor ability of the lower limbs, or is there any fecal incontinence, is there any bowel control, sometimes there may be impaction of stool, sometimes there may be fecal incontinence. There may be babies who may have urinary incontinence. So you have to assess all these things in the pre-operative period, assess for the motor activity of the lower limb. And usually this is corrected in 48 to 72 hours, and the surgical correction is done by repair of the sac. And again in the post-operative period, we have to observe for the head circumference, because sometimes after the correction of spina bifida, neural tube defect, it may lead to hydrocephalus. So keep a watch on the signs of hydrocephalus and keep a record of the occipito frontal head circumference recording. Keep a check on the on the bowel control and the bladder control and the motor ability. It should not retard what the child had in the pre-operative phase. Now, how to help out these babies and the parents, those babies who have problem of neurogenic bladder. Once I say neurogenic bladder, it means they have urine in the bladder but they are not able to evacuate it completely. So parents have to be taught about the intermittent clean catheterization. Teach the mother how intermittent clean catheterization can be done so that the bowel bladder can be evacuated and it should not lead to urinary stasis and UTI, because these are the common problems with these children. And also if a baby is suffering with fecal incontinence, in those cases we have to make sure that the nappies have to be changed as soon as it gets soiled so that it does not lead to skin excoriation. While tying the napkin, see that, or the diaper, see that it should not compress onto the spina bifida sac, because any compression on the spina bifida sac can lead to its rupture, and you know it can lead to various other problems. Then if it is fecal impaction, in those cases one may have to administer suppositories for having the evacuation, and later on when the baby grows up, then fiber has to be added to the diet. And if it is fecal incontinence, then the regular bowel habits may help these babies. So this is in very brief how to help out these children. Then other very important thing is that a child born with spina bifida will be dealt by a multidisciplinary approach. We need help of orthopedician, we need help of rehabilitation department as physical therapists may be needed, as well as we need the help of neurosurgeon and the neurology. Of course, the nurse forms an integral component of the multidisciplinary team.
Surekha, you want to add something?
No, I think that's been very briefly touched on what are the problems which the family and the mother has, and the child of course is having, and how they need to be taken care of is been dealt very well.
Okay, thank you very much for your detailed presentation on spina bifida, Dr. Jyoti Serene. I also thank Surekha Sama for giving detailed account of hydrocephalus. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much.